The notion about the childlike nature of pre-modern archaic human being is the most important notion ever developed and won in the history of human and social disciplines. That archaic or primitive adults stood on stages typical for children in modern society, aged between the 4th and the 10th year of life, is absolutely strange, remarkable, astonishing, and at first glance almost incredible. However, whatever we take to prove of the equation between children's stages and those of ancient or pre-modern humankind, whatever we take as example, we see the full evidence for the equation. We can take the belief in animism or the animistic schemata, or we can take the magical belief, or we can take the belief in metamorphosis. We can take the several forms of conceptual realism. We can take the forms of logic, the understandings of causality and chance, probability and necessity. We can take the moral ideas, the ideas about law and politics. Everywhere we find the full identity between the archaic adult psyche and that of the child. When we take, for example, the first 6 books of Jean Piaget, he had written in the 20s and 30s of the past century. For example, La représentation du monde chez l'enfant, ou la causalité physique chez l'enfant, ou le jugement et raisonnement chez l'enfant. Every single piece Piaget described in these books are also to find in the core and in the center of the archaic adult psyche, as it is reported from ethnological textbooks and other books and researchers. There is not a single gap between that what stage theory describes pertaining to children and the descriptions pertaining to archaic adult psyche. There is a full identity without any gap, without any exceptions. The problem is that while the child aged 4 to 6 or even 4 to 8 may not be able to prepare an own dish or an own meal, archaic adult was able not only to prepare his own food, but also to do everything what is necessary to maintain livelihood and to lead one's life more or less successfully. He knows better than we know how to live in his surroundings. He knows better than we do how to fish, to hunt, or to find tracks in dense forest, or how to survive in Greenland or in the Arctic region. And how we can explain this difference between a low psychological stage and skills and abilities that do not match to those of children aged 4 to 7 or 4 to 10. The first thing we have to consider is when we, for a moment, reason about the possibilities and the abilities of animals, for example, of birds, how they find their way when they fly at high speed through a dense forest without big problems. It is impossible to explain this by instinctive behavior. There is a certain kind of intelligence to move at high speed through problematic environments and to find the right way. It is a form of intelligence, though the animal intelligence is usually limited to the sensorimotor stage, and these animals do not attain the stages of children aged 5. And this is the first idea to understand why it is possible for an archaic adult gaining knowledge and skills to a certain extent, to a certain stage, though being on the pre-operational stage, though being similar or even identical, pertaining to the understanding of causality, nature, logic, law, and so on. That is the first idea we must have to understand this coherences that surmount abilities of usual social scientists to cope with and to deal with. The usual and common social scientist is not able to look through these problematic and complicated structures, because when he focuses on the abilities of archaic adult person, he is not anymore capable to consider the evidence that shows the equation between the pre-operational stage and the psychological life of archaic adult human being. But we must take together these two paths, and then we can understand that when you stay on the pre-operational stage over years and even over decades, then you can accumulate knowledge and skills the pre-operational child has not. And in any case, this is the strangest and most remarkable fact, one in social sciences over the past centuries, that the archaic human being stays on the stage of a child. And therefore, the theory of the psychogenetic development of humankind is the most important notion of social sciences. That humankind went from the pre-operational over the concrete operational to the formal operational stage. And that the formal operational stage is a recent phenomenon. This is the most fundamental description of the psychological life of peoples in history. We have now deeper formulated and deeper founded knowledge about humans than that knowledge that describes that the archaic human being stood on the pre-operational stage, that humankind went over concrete operational to formal operational stages, while the modern human being is usually staying on the formal operational stage. This is the most fundamental description of the psychological life of peoples. And therefore, the structural genetic theory program, who has fully evidenced and encompassingly described this fact, is the most pertinent theory of sociology, psychology, history, ethnology, and all other social and human disciplines. And in every single social and human discipline, the structural genetic theory program or the stage theory should be the eminent approach. And the structural genetic theory program is the only theory ever developed in the history of sciences to encompass all other disciplines under one common roof. When we compare now the genetic epistemology of Jean Piaget with the structural genetic theory program I have developed over the past 40 years, we must come to the following conclusions. Jean Piaget has described the development of children. He has developed his theory to find a key to understand the history of humankind. That is, he wanted to achieve that, what I have done over the past 40 years. He wanted to use and to apply child psychology to develop folk psychology, to develop a historical psychology. He wanted to understand the history of mind, reason, philosophy and sciences, culture and society by the means of child psychology. And therefore, you find in his writings and books always or very often corresponding remarks where he described resemblances between the stages of children and mental patterns of ancient philosophy or ancient worldview. You find these remarks only in short sections or in a few sentences, dispersed in his works, books and articles. If you would collect all his corresponding remarks, you could complete 1, 2, or even 3 monographs. But actually, they are dispersed here and there in his books and articles. He wrote only 1 monograph where he made an exception to this method, Psychogenèse et l'histoire des sciences of 1983, is the only book he wrote where he devoted the application of child psychology to history. This book is devoted to the transfer work of child psychology to history, to the history of sciences only. And there in this book, he tries more or less thoroughly the application of child psychology to the history of sciences. In all his other books, even in his 3-volume work about the history of sciences of the year of 1950, you do not find this method thoroughly. He refers in these 3 books here and there to the notions of child psychology. When he tries to describe the history of mathematics, physics, biology, sociology, and so on. But he does not do this in a comprehensive, detailed, and encompassing way. And therefore, I regard only his Psychogenèse et l'Histoire des Sciences as a monograph, as a book, where he did the transfer work decisively. And therefore, we can say that the genetic epistemology of Jean Piaget is, despite different opinions and remarks, nothing else than a description of child developmental psychology. Jean Piaget has ever been, throughout his life, a child psychologist. Despite his ambition to do more, to do some transfer work, but nonetheless, his contribution to the transfer work was only scanty and was only done with little effort. He remained throughout his life a child psychologist. What his disciples say say not. So one can say he went only the first step to the summit as a structural genetic theory program states. Or he went the first 500 meters of a mountain with a height of 1 kilometer, and I went the second half of the way, the additional 500 meters up to the summit. And when we compare now the genetic epistemology of Jean Piaget with the structural genetic theory program, we come to following conclusions. The transfer work was done mainly by my person in the past 40 years. I devoted to this transfer work 14 books and about 130 articles, among them 88 journal articles. And therefore, also with regard to quantitative terms, I did a lot to succeed Jean Piaget in his work. That children go through stages is not very much astonishing and surprising. But that is what Piaget had shown. Piaget showed something that is not so surprising, because what else should discriminate a suckling or an infant from an adolescent when not stages? So that the archaic adult human being stood on the pre-operational stage is by the factor 100 more surprising, astonishing, remarkable, and breathtaking than the notion that a child aged 5 is on the pre-operational stage. And I have evidenced, and I'm the only one who has done this, that everything Piaget described pertaining to children is relevant, crucial, and manifest in the psyche and personality of archaic human being. And this notion is by the factor 100 more relevant, more informative, more breathtaking than that what Piaget has done. And therefore, I would say that the structural genetic theory program is seen from this point of view more important, more breathtaking, more relevant and pertinent than the theory of Piaget himself. And therefore, I come to the conclusion that the structural genetic theory program is the most important successor of the genetic epistemology of Jean Piaget. It is the most eminent offshoot of Piagetian theory. It is the most relevant developer of Piaget's theory. And therefore, I see my work as a most relevant succession of Piaget's theory. I have done that, what Piaget always wanted to achieve. I have realized his life goal, something he did not accomplish, because he hesitated to do the transfer work in a full way. He hesitated and was insecure how far one could go to do the transfer work. You find in his writings remarks where he doubts into the equations, where he doubts into the childish nature of archaic human being. And then some books or some articles or some sections later, he repeats the description of the identity, of the resemblance. But he always hesitated to do the transfer work in a comprehensive and fully elaborated way. He was insecure. He doubted, he hesitated. And I showed that the equations are complete and do not leave any gap, something he didn't understand. And therefore, my work is the consequence of Piaget's ambition himself. My work is that what Piaget always wanted to carry out. And therefore, it is a tragedy that he could not anymore encounter my work. The first pieces of my work appeared or were accomplished or were written down 7 years after his death. And this is a great tragedy that he could not anymore enjoy that what I have done over the past 40 years. It was not only Piaget who believed in the childlike mentality of the archaic human being. In sociology, it was mainly Auguste Comte, the founder of the discipline, and Norbert Elias. He is said to be the last classic of sociology. The three stages law of Auguste Comte's sociology resembles to Piagetian stage theory in a remarkable way. The theologian phase resembles the pre-operational stage. The stage of metaphysics, limited to early modern Europe, resembles to the concrete operational stage. And the positive stage resembles to the formal operational stage. And according to Auguste Comte, the positive stage came into being in the 18th century. Not so far away from that, what I assume to be the beginning of the formal operational stage. And Auguste Comte understood that there are strong resemblances between archaic human beings and children, and that cognitive maturation of the modern humankind has something to do with growing cognitions and cognitive maturation. And Norbert Elias said that the only sociologist he ever appreciated was Auguste Comte. And I can understand Norbert Elias very well with this contention. And Norbert Elias followed the idea of Auguste Comte more or less in his theory of civilization, published first in the 1930s. And in this book, the second volume of this book, the second part of this book, he compares children to archaic human beings. He did not rely and did not resort to the full notions of child or developmental psychology, what would have been possible even in this time. He could have resorted to Heinz Werner, whom he knew, but he did not do this in this work, in this book. He referred to Sigmund Freud, to the theory of personality of Sigmund Freud, to the model it, superego, and ego, maintaining that the archaic human being as a child has a weak superego, but a strong it. That means has strong emotions and drives and a weak conscience. And with this contention, Elias maintained that the resemblances between children and medieval human beings are not of a superfluous and shallow character, but that the common structures between children and medieval humans are deeply entrenched, are deeply rooted. And he describes now the behavior and thinking of medieval men against the background of this comparison, of this resemblance. He described the extremely violent and aggressive behavior of medieval men, saying it is a childish mentality that medieval man is so aggressive and so violent. Or he says, medieval man has no table manners. That he has no feeling for social distance, that medieval man reasons egocentrically, and that he is unable to reason about complex relations, and so on. So, and that he has a strong sexual drive and is not very good at retaining and urging his sexual drive and so on. The question is, was Norbert Elias able to prove of the equation between children and archaic human beings, between medieval men and children? Let's take the example of violence. Elias himself described that the state and the police was weak in medieval times, and that therefore people were forced to resort to violence when they wanted to defend their rights. But when he says this and describes this, he gives an alternative factor to the greater violence of medieval men. And then we have the question, how can he evidence that the greater violence of medieval man is also caused by his childish mentality, by his primitivity? And if he investigates this fact in his writings, then we discover that Elias has not a real and genuine proof of the childish mentality of medieval man pertaining to violence. And the same we can say about table manners. That medieval man has bad table manners might be true. And that children have bad table manners is obvious and apparent. And we can easily understand that the weak table manners of a child originate in the lack of discipline in the child. But we can also imagine very easily that it would be possible to educate in a very short time a medieval man to apply more distinguished table manners without the necessity that he must increase his psychological stages at all. That means, while the lack of table manners in the child is due to a lack of discipline, a child cannot ignore, a child cannot surmount in an easy way. However, an archaic adult can be educated to gain good table manners without the necessity that he has to replace his entire personality, that he has to surmount his pre-operational stage. And therefore, the hint at table manners, or the hint at violence, or the hint at sexual behavior does not suffice to evidence the contention medieval man be staying on the pre-operational or childish stage. And I have checked Elias' theory in my habilitation, in my book Zivilisation und Strukturgenese, Norbert Elias und Jean Piaget im Vergleich, published in the publisher's house Surkamp in the year 2000. I have checked Elias' theory, and I have shown that he cannot prove of the rightness of his theory. That what he is describing in maintaining is more or less correct. His descriptions are more or less correct. And his contentions that medieval man was staying on the childish stage is also correct, but he cannot give a proof, a clear and convincing evidence. Neither the disciples nor the critics of Norbert Elias have ever realized that he has not a proof. Most of his disciples neither understood his theory at all. They did not even grasp that Norbert Elias has maintained that medieval man was a big child. They did not even grasp that. But even those that understood this, because it is simply written there, you only have to glean. But even those who have understood this did not understand the lack of evidence in his book. Elias became famous with his editions of civilization theory during the 1970s. And this has to do with the fashions, vivid and present at that time. Cultural relativism has not gained an overweight in social sciences and human disciplines at that time. At that time, there lived still a lot of scientists or sociologists or so that were born in the 1920s and were educated at a time where cultural relativism was not has not gained an overweight. But from 1980 onwards, cultural relativism gained an overweight and an ascendancy in theorizing and in making the dominant worldview. Had the Surkamp Publishers House published the civilization theory in 1980 or 1985, I would doubt in the success the book had experienced. But in the 70s, the things were open, were still open. Nonetheless, the relativistic critics appeared against Norbert Elias, especially on a sociology congress in Amsterdam in 1981. And at this congress, Elias said that one should refer to Piaget's theory to support his theory, to find an empirical basis and a theoretical frame that would allow to confirm and to evidence the contentions of his theory. But even in the following 9 years, Piaget did not follow this idea in his writings. That means the civilization theory was not evidenced over 50 years from the beginning of existence in the 1930s to the end of Elias in 1990. It was me who followed his idea he formulated at the Amsterdam Congress in 1981, because I developed Piagetian theory to confirm and to verify the civilization theory of Norbert Elias. This is what I have done over the past 40 years. And I showed the lack of evidence in his theory, and I brought the evidence that was needed to evidence the childish character of medieval man, and to evidence the psychogenetic development of humankind, going from the pre-operational to the formal operational stage, from childish to adult structures. My theory of the childish mentality of archaic human being and of the psychogenetic development of humankind is by the factor 100 more elaborated, more detailed, more informative, more comprehensive, and more coherent than all what Elias himself has described in his lifetime. But it is not only my anthropology and my theory of psychogenesis 100 times better than that what Elias has done, also my application of the psychogenetic theory to the understanding of history is by the factor 100 better than that what Elias has done. Because Elias has applied his theory of psychogenesis to the understanding of violence, table manners, sexual relations, understanding of time, and that was it more or less. Elias did not apply his theory of civilization, his theory of psychogenesis, to the understanding of the history of politics, arts, philosophy, sciences, law, morals. But that is what I have done. And Elias also did not apply his theory to the understanding of the evolution of modern society. And I explained and described that the rise of modern industrial society originated in the emergence of the adolescent stage of formal operations. Elias did not contend and did not describe that the psychogenetic development caused the emergence of modern society. He did not understand and describe this. Nonetheless, I regard Norbert Elias as the only sociologist of the past 100 years I appreciate as somebody who has done groundwork. James Coleman did not do groundwork. Luhmann did not do groundwork. Richard Sennett did not do groundwork. Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu did not do groundwork. Norbert Elias did groundwork. And I see myself in the heritage of Norbert Elias, and I see my structural genetic theory program as the only follower of the civilization theory of Norbert Elias. And when the Marburg sociologist Dirk Käsler said on anniversary of Norbert Elias in Essen in 1991, that the future of sociology will depend on the understanding and involvement and resort to the civilization theory of Norbert Elias, then I support this thesis, but saying that the structural genetic theory program is a real follower of the civilization theory and is much more elaborated than the civilization theory of Norbert Elias. Let's come to a third group of scholars that should be compared to the structural genetic theory program. And I think here about theoreticians of ethnology. To me, ethnology is the most interesting social and human discipline, apart from developmental psychology. There were scholars with a greatness and ability sociologists never had. Edward Tylor, James George Frazer, and Lucien Lévy-Bruhl were scholars of a greatness not one sociologist has ever reached, without perhaps those who followed Piagetian theory in a right manner. These scholars are the first rank, are the first station in the international social and human disciplines. The knowledge of Edward Tylor, manifest in his book Primitive Culture, is unsurmounted. It is one of the best books ever written in the history of human and social disciplines. There was not one sociologist, not one ethnologist, who wrote such a great book after 1950. And I see the same realized in the work of James George Frazer, who can be said to be one of the greatest scholars who have ever lived in the social and human disciplines. His knowledge is unattained, unreached, unparalleled by any other author. His knowledge about the history of religion, myths, customs, manners, and so on, is of a fullness and greatness that can't be compared. And especially Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who wrote between 1910 and 1940 7 books about the primitive mind and primitive worldview. These books are of an absolute necessity. If social and human disciplines could be taken seriously, then this would require that his books were textbooks present and given to any student of the social and human disciplines. Every person who accomplishes a bachelor or a master in the social and human disciplines should have studied the works of Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. And these 3 authors, Tylor, Frazer, and Lévy-Bruhl, were once well known and well accounted across the social and human disciplines. They were cited and referred to in a great deal of commentaries, books, articles, and so on. They were famous not only in their lifetime, but also afterwards, up to 1980 or so. Nowadays, they are often forgotten and ridiculed by people who are not able to understand their greatness due to the adherence to cultural relativism. But it is absolutely clear that these three scholars, representatives of the British and the French School of Anthropology, tried to understand the nature of primitive thinking and primitive mind. And they were good at that. Though they did not find the key, the pivotal and fundamental theory to explain primitive mind and worldview, as they did not understood the relevance of child or developmental psychology to be a fundamental theory to their descriptions, they nevertheless described very well, and their descriptions can be encapsulated in the scaffolds of developmental psychology quite easily. That is what a lot of commentators have done, for example, with the work of Lévy-Bruhl. Piaget himself understood Lévy-Bruhl as if he would refer to developmental psychology. And Heinz Werner understood Lévy-Bruhl in the same manner. And it was James Frazer who said in 1927 that those anthropologists of the future who would resort to child or developmental psychology would be those who would find the key for a proper understanding, and that these guys, that these scholars would be the Darwins and Einsteins of the anthropological disciplines. And that is something the Orientalist and Egyptologist Hermann Schneider already maintained in his book Kultur und Religion der alten Ägypter of the year 1909. And that is the case. I see my theory in the heritage of the French and British School of Anthropology, in the heritage of the achievements of Edward Tylor, James Frazer, and Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. Whoever wants to understand the true meaning of the work of these three scholars should refer to the structural genetic theory program, because the structural genetic theory program does not only approve of the great achievements of these three scholars, the structural genetic theory program elaborates also their theories and brings them to higher stations. And when we compare this now to the current human and social disciplines, we see the great difference. That what is done in the hyphen sociologist cannot compete with the structural genetic theory program. Authors working in the hyphen sociologist, let's say people who work on religion and make sociology of religion. These people have not the slightest idea how to explain the existence of religion, how to explain religious history. They know nothing about the fundamentals of religion. Or let's take sociologists working of sociology of culture. These people know nothing about the fundamental characteristics of modern culture, the fundamental characteristics of archaic culture. These people know nothing. Or let's take people working in the field of sociological theory. There is nothing today. Nothing is there. There's not one great approach today. And the work of Anthony Giddens or Ulrich Beck or Pierre de Bourdieu or James Coleman, these people know nothing about the fundamentals of the historical development of humankind. They know nothing about the psychogenetic development of humankind. And therefore, it was quite clear that Norbert Elias was unable to appreciate Talcott Parsons or George Herbert Mead or other sociologists. He did not appreciate these guys as great scholars. And nor do I. I follow Elias in his contentions. In his contention, he formulated in 1968 in the introduction of his civilization theory, where he writes that sociologists like Durkheim and Weber and Parsons have simply not the reflectivity to understand the psychogenetic development of humankind. That's quite right. And that's the same situation today. Sociologists of today simply have not the ability, the reflective intelligence to understand what is crucial pertaining to the history of humankind. And that explains why sociologists of today appreciate very much the work of Niklas Luhmann or of Michel Foucault. One could assume that Niklas Luhmann and his system theory is something that resembles to civilization theory and structural genetic theory program as he describes the development of religion, politics, economy, arts, and so on. But when you study his theory, then you see that the system theory has not the means, has not the tools to describe the archaic patterns of law, the archaic patterns of morals, the archaic patterns of politics and arts and so on. His theory can only perceive archaic structures, but cannot explain them, cannot discern them, cannot address them in a genuine and true manner. And therefore, the system theory can also not explain the historical transitions and trajectories and cannot understand the modern structures of these phenomena, of these cultural areas, and describe the specific and unique ways of modern and current manifestations of these cultural areas. System theory is divided and separated from reality as his theoretical tools are incapable to address and to explain the true historical movements. And therefore, if a person, a scholar, has a certain stage of scientific intelligence, then he sees immediately the immaterial and third-class worth of system theory. And this verse with Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is said to be the most cited scholar in social and human disciplines over decades. But what he has to offer. Let's take his work Les mots et les choses of 1971. What is there to find? He describes there that the idea of resemblance is the core principle of medieval thinking. When we want to understand the nature of medieval thinking, we must refer to the principle of resemblance, he tells there. When we check and examine this contention, we determine that the principle of resemblance is not the core and the center of medieval thought. Child or developmental psychology knows the principle of resemblance and denotes this as symbolism and phenomenism, and knows this that it is a specific part and manifestation of the pre-operational stage. The pre-operational and the concrete operational stages are the foundations of medieval thought. And the modern way of thinking is made by the formal operational stage. When you compare this description with that of Michel Foucault, you find a difference between the factor 1000 and the factor 1. The stage theory is by the factor 1000 more developed and elaborated than the simple and primitive description of Michel Foucault. And therefore you can see that modern social scientists are completely incapable to discriminate between charlatanerie, dilettantism as a second block, good craftsmanship as a third block, and great science as a fourth block. They do not know whether they have before them charlatanerie, dilettantism, craftsmanship, or great science. They take dilettantism as great science, and they take great science as dilettantism, because they are unable to examine theories from a bird perspective, because they are on a stage where they look at theories from below to above. And therefore, they cannot take a bird perspective from where it is possible to discriminate correctly between dilettantism, craftsmanship, and great theory. And therefore, they are unable to understand and to compare Lucien Lévy-Bruhl with Michel Foucault. When I compare Lucien Lévy-Bruhl with Michel Foucault, I see a difference between a genius and a dilettante. And if you cannot see this, then you are not a great scholar, then you are not a great scientist. It will need centuries until social sciences of today will become that what biology or physics is even today. And the structural genetic theory program is discriminated from all other approaches by centuries of development.